Your book title really got my attention. Original Sin is
Right.
a Lie.
So what's original sin? Where does that come from? A monk named St. Augustine of Hippo said we're originally dirty, a divine condemnation, filthy, guilt, shame, and so on. That's the veil of Maya. That's the veil of ignorance. And we don't know the true essence of our own nature and the nature of all beings.
I'm here today with Bob Peck, who is a Festive Award-winning filmmaker, author, lawnmower meditator, and a spiritual student of Christ, Krishna, the Buddha, and Paramahansa Yogananda. He also has a bachelor's degree in religious studies and radio, TV, and film from the University of Texas. He's been making conscious films since graduating in 2011, and I know at least one of them can be found on YouTube, The Kingdom Within, which is an incredible film.
Thanks, Melissa. Thrilled to be here. Love your work, love your podcast. So glad to be on.
Likewise, I would love to start by learning a little bit about you and your personal spiritual journey.
My mom actually shared this, which is a funny background. I'm from Austin, Texas. I grew up in Texas, and I've really been reading Eastern spirituality for a long time. I'm 35. And someone asked my mom recently, your son wrote a book about religion and spirituality. Like, what's up with that? And she goes, when all the other kids were reading Harry Potter, Bob was reading Thich Nhat Hanh. And that's true. I was reading Living Buddha, Living Christ, I think when I was like 13 or 14, and just was captivated by the parallels, really, like the interfaith connectivity as opposed to the distinctions, and wound up, Austin for folks who don't know, Austin, Texas is a pretty open-minded city. It's perhaps uniquely open in the state of Texas, which I'm grateful for. It's Willie Nelson city. We have the creatives and the weirdos and the spiritual minded people. So I come up in this town, and I went to school at UT. I got like you said, a bachelor's in religious studies, a specialty in the New Testament, alongside of, it kind of took them all: Indian Buddhism, Sufism, shamanism, everything that was really, really interesting to me, and just continued the study. Religious studies and filmmaking were my two, and made films about religion, which, Melissa, I didn't realize nobody would want to watch.
Oh, no. I would have if I knew about them.
Well, thank you. I think they still hold up. Actually, The Kingdom Within I'm still proud of it. I made it when I was 23, 24 years old, so a while ago. But it's very serious, I think, is the issue. I was like, I'm going to make like PBS, like Ken Burns style documentaries on religion as like a 23-year-old, and what was great about them was I learned, I interviewed a lot of people in these traditions. The Kingdom Within is about yoga and Christianity. And so I interviewed pastors and yoga teachers and a couple of swamis and, a couple of hardcore evangelical preachers in Texas. And, I ended up interviewing 18 people for about an hour and a half that made an 80-minute film. So that was kind of I was telling that to a friend of mine. I was, I have this like little egoic self-consciousness about not having, master's or PhD in this stuff. And then somebody was like, well, you've made films about this over 10 years. That was your kind of extended schooling, if you will. And so I think that there's some validity to that. But then, yeah, I put a book out last year called Original Sin is a Lie, which is my provocative titled kind of introduction to mystic spirituality, mystic philosophy, which we can go into mysticism more deeply. But, that's my life's work. And that's kind of what I've been talking to people about and going deeper with from there. But that's my humble background.
Thank you for sharing. So your book title, I think, is also your Instagram title, Original Sin is a Lie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really got my attention, because I was raised in Reformed Christianity, and we followed the 5 points of Calvinism. And of course, in my opinion, and I will preface this by saying I have, at this point in my life, no issue with the religion of Christianity. I have religion issue with some of the teachings, but I think that Christians are beautiful, genuine people, and that Christianity is a valid path to God. But the extreme version that I was raised with, the worst, the worst of the 5 points of Calvinism was total depravity. Basically, the idea that you were just original sin, like you're born in this fallen state and you deserve nothing and you can do nothing to help yourself. I'd love to hear a little bit more of your perspective, because you said that that concept of original sin being a lie ties into the mystical interpretation, and I'd love to hear you connect those dots for us.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad that you were able to come out of that rigidity in a healthy way, in a self-compassionate way. You read in my bio, I consider myself a spiritual student of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm a big fan of him, and studied the New Testament formation, essentially the early Christian communities at UT, and just you really what happens in Bible scholarship. And I'm not a Bible scholar. I've said that before. I'm a student of Bible scholarship. You got to have graduate to get that title. But anyway, when you look at scholarship around it, you really see how human the developments are. You see how human the texts are, and you see how varied and really diverse even the early Christian communities are. There's not one single tradition, even in the first century, which is pretty amazing. Very early on, the Gospels themselves, the Markan, Matthean, Lucan, and Johannine communities are separate. There's different uses of different terms. In, for example, the Johannine community, the Gospel of John's, they use different terminology, different epithets for Jesus than the Pauline community, the Pauline epistles, the Pauline tradition. And that's still within 100 years of his death. So here we are a couple thousand years later. It just keeps, it's like more and more tentacles, if you will, that keep schisming outward. And really, I think my thesis, if you will, about the Bible, or kind of central idea, is that it is a beautiful document of mostly very ethical teachings that are powerful and transformative. The real teachings of Jesus, if you will, which I discuss greatly in my book, are profound. He tells us to love your enemies, and he actually tells us, I think somewhat antithetically to original sin, that the kingdom of heaven is within you, which is Luke 17:21, right there in the middle of the New Testament. So what's original sin? Where does that come from? It really is codified by a monk named Augustine, or Saint Augustine of Hippo, who's about 300 years after the death of Jesus. And my book opens with the scene of Augustine and Pelagius were basically two monks that were arguing. And Augustine said, we're originally dirty and we need, essentially Christ's resurrection and just for the salvation of all humanity. And Pelagius said, we're actually originally neutral. We're not originally sinful or originally divine. And, Augustine was more powerful. He had more political sophistication, and Pelagius was excommunicated. He rode out of town. Augustine was working with a few lines from Paul, admittedly, and also Genesis. So the actual Garden of Eden story does inform what essentially Paul's doing and Augustine is doing in terms of our identity. But again, I think the actual master, for me, is some people said, well, what do you think about what Ignatius says about the Augustinian, you can get really deep in the text. And for me, the main person I'm interested in understanding is the master. What did he say?
Right.
I don't really care that much what Augustine or even Paul said, which most people know this, I think, but just to be clear, Paul never met Jesus. He very likely knew the apostles themselves, but the second most famous person in the religion never knew the first most popular. So it's a very human, political, developing religious tradition that, to me, really opens up. Like you said, it becomes so fascinating to see how it develops and see the variations and kind of schools of thought that were making different interpretations and so on. And I guess to come back to your original question, the mystics, which exist in every religious tradition, there's Christian mystics, there's, Islam, Muslim mystics are called the Sufis, Jewish mystics are called the Kabbalists, the Kabbalah. Hinduism is in general, which is a hard one to generalize, but Hinduism is pretty mystical at large. And then, there's variations, but the mystics have this idea, essentially, it really goes beyond ideas, but it's the idea that the divine is in our heart. The divine is in our very being and every being, and kind of we're all special and not special. There's this kind of oneness and unity across all creation, and that's always resonated with me. The more kind of scholarship and more study, the parallels just keep coming, essentially, and they line up to me with the teachings of Jesus. They line up with the teachings of the Buddha. They line up with the teachings of Sri Krishna. And so that's what I'm interested in talking about, and helping people come to understand and understand myself, as opposed to you're dirty, you're filthy, how dare you? It's like, no. Let's look at what the real masters, the real men and women throughout history have told us. And what they tell us is the divine is in you and you're in the divine. You're a precious child, essentially. You're a precious child of Creator. You're beloved.
I love that. And like I was telling you before we started, I really love the unique angle that you bring to this with your education in the history of and development of Christianity, and also all of the knowledge that you have about all the various different mystical traditions. And so I want to come back to this idea of this message, that the divine is in our being, that you have traced throughout these different traditions. I want to come back to that. But before we go there, let's talk a little bit more about the development of Christianity, because this is something I have a huge personal interest in. When I was going through my deconstruction, I read some Bart Ehrman books, and I did a little
Yeah.
bit of digging for
Love Bart.
myself. Right. And I discovered some things, like, for instance, how even in the New Testament text itself, you see the contradictions are right there. Like, Peter and Paul had disagreements, and clearly they were in two different groups that had already developed just like a decade after Jesus's life. So, like, first of all, what are some of the very early groups that developed, and how did their teachings differ?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I mentioned, I'm kind of rereading some old textbooks right now because I'm trying to get sharper and being able to make commentaries on this stuff. One of my favorite examples I write about in my book, which is the condemnation of the Pharisees, which is a really nice example of essentially the humanness of the New Testament. There's a textbook I have, I think it's up here actually. Yeah, it's called The Gospel Parallels. And essentially what it is they take every event in the four Gospels, and what's kind of funny is John is hardly ever compared because it's so different than what's called the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It's mostly Mark, Matthew, and Luke in three columns. And then that's what Bible scholarship does. They look at each event and compare them, and then you can start to draw conclusions. That's what Bart Ehrman does so well, and New Testament scholars do so well. They're really trying to understand the character in Mark's gospel of Jesus and the situations going on, Matthew, Luke, and so on. And just a quick side note, when I say character of Jesus in the gospel, I don't mean that Jesus was a made-up character. He was very, very, very likely historically a man who walked the earth. But by the time, about 40 years later, as we have Mark, 45, 50, Matthew, Luke, and so on, he's a character in these narratives. And so what are the differences in those characters? But one of this great example is the condemnation of the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, who most people probably heard that term before, they were essentially the precursor to the rabbinical Jews. They were, they were an authority figure in ancient Judea, and they kind of had like running for mayor energy, is kind of how I've described them before. They were kind of like showy, and they were teachers of the law, and they kind of liked being, have they had some moral superiority, not that uncommon in religion. Some proud leaders, essentially, and Jesus calls out their hypocrisy basically in all of the Gospels. He uses them as an example of being hypocritical. And when you look at, there's a specific section called the condemnation of the Pharisees. When you look at Mark's version, it's very slim. He says a couple of words. He's saying, "Oh, well, even the Pharisees do that," ha ha, kind of jokingly. Luke's gospel also very short, maybe a paragraph or two on the Pharisees. And then you look at Matthew's gospel and that same event, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, it is like 2 pages in Matthew's gospel of him just leaning into the Pharisees. He even calls them, "You den of vipers," which is pretty mean.
Right.
It's a rude thing to say for someone who also says, "Love your enemies," and,
Right.
forgives his killers, pretty peaceful, profound, unity conscious person. And what we know from an academic standpoint historically is that Matthew's gospel was very likely written in Galilee, in the Jewish homeland, because it's very Jewish. Matthew's Jesus is most concerned with the law. It's really the Jewish gospel. Luke's gospel, for example, was very likely written outside of the Jewish homeland in the larger Greco-Roman world, because Jesus is, in Luke's gospel, is more concerned about the Gentiles and the poor, and not as concerned about Jewish tradition. So that's a big difference in those two New Testament gospels. In Galilee at that time, which is around 70 to 80 when Matthew was written, 70, 75 CE, the Jesus following Jews, they're not quite Christians at this time. The Jesus following Jews and the Pharisees were in a fierce sectarian political dispute. What happened was the Romans sacked the temple in 69-70 in the Roman Jewish War, which was traumatizing. To know it, kind of anything about the Gospels, you have to understand what happened when they were written, which is the Roman army comes in to Jerusalem and sacks the city and destroys the temple. There was a Jewish revolt, and in the late 60s, and the Roman army comes in and just massacres people. It's terrible, and it's blood ran in the streets. It was like some crazy situation. So that's the climate in which the New Testament Gospels are being written. And when the temple is destroyed, the temple Jews, were called the Sadducees, are essentially gone. There's no more central authority within Judaism, which was the temple and the temple Jews. So now you kind of have this power vacuum of Pharisees, and then this new group of the Jesus following Jews, which is growing in popularity very quickly. And so from a scholarly standpoint, you can say, well, the author of the Gospel of Matthew is adding on all of this criticism of the Pharisees by his main character for political reasons, because they're in this fierce sectarian dispute. When you understand the historical context, you say, oh, clearly Jesus didn't say this. It's not in any other Gospels, to this extent. It's much, much smaller. So, learning things like that and really seeing like the humanness and the historical context for all of this helps to paint, I think, a clearer picture of, who Jesus actually was and who he actually wasn't. What was the product of the later tradition? Things like Matthew's condemnation, things like Augustine's original sin, etc.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That kind of leads
Sure.
into a personal question that I've had for a while that I've never asked anyone this. But when I was doing some research into these early groups and trying to figure out for myself who Jesus really was, what was his message? What were his teachings? Which, like you pointed out, it's over 2,000 years ago. It's like, can we even track that down? That's a question I don't know the answer to. But what kept coming up over and over to me is that there was these different groups, and the Ebionites was one that kept coming up. The Ebionites
Hmm.
were more of like the Jewish reformers, I guess, maybe, that wanted to still stick to the Jewish, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but wanted to still stick to the Jewish traditions. And then there were the other like mystical and Gnostic groups, like maybe Paul's writings seem more mystical, and I would think that the original Jesus's message was maybe more mystical based on like the mystical interpretations of other religions. However, if his original disciples, like say James and Peter, were part of the Ebionite group that was coming up against Paul, what does that really say about Jesus's original teachings? I don't know if that makes any sense, but what are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
no, it's true, and it's a really worthy question. And admittedly, I'm not familiar with the Ebionites, so all good for going deep with me. But I am familiar with the Gnostics, quite a bit, which is a become almost like trendy word and kind of spiritual gram and new age world, which we're both a part, which I think is cool to me because the Gnostics are worth knowing about and understanding. And essentially they were actually also a lot earlier than we initially realized. We thought that they were more in the second century, and we're learning now that they actually probably existed in the late first century as well, kind of closer to the time of the writing of the Gospels. And I'm working on more material about this, so stay tuned with my work if you're interested. The Gospel of Thomas I write about in the book, which really is extremely impactful, I think, in helping also to understand the authentic teachings of Jesus. And actually, before I go into Thomas, what I'll say to you to answer your question directly is there's actually a really good source of trying to understand kind of who Jesus was and what he was saying called, I believe it's called the Five Gospels, but it's by a group called the Jesus Seminar,
Oh
who
yeah,
are
I've heard
worth
that.
knowing about.
Mhm.
And they were a collection of a few hundred scholars, some of whom extremely reputable. Not all, apparently. I heard like criticisms of the Jesus Seminar where they're like, that guy shouldn't have been in. Anyway, there's at least a couple dozen that are world renowned. And what they did was they go through every red letter of Jesus in the four gospels, and they color it. They give it a new color, essentially based on likelihood of him saying it. And what they're doing is they're looking at historical context, like the Pharisee thing. They're also looking at occurrences. So if something occurs in more sources, it's more likely that it was realistic. That's not perfect, that it's still an imperfect method, but it's pretty good. It's better than, you know, hypothesizing without any grounded understanding. So that's a good one. And then, the Gospel of Thomas, we found humanity, we rediscovered it in 1945. We had a couple of shreds of it from a garbage can in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, but we didn't have much. I think it was a couple of verses in Greek. And we knew it existed because we have all these letters from early church fathers basically saying, Gospel of Matthew, yes. Gospel of Thomas, no. We have their correspondence, so we know we have allusions to all these different books. And yeah, it's a very miraculous discovery. I mean, it's one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, certainly of the modern era, which is a goat herder chases a goat in a village in Egypt near Alexandria, which is a very, big city back in Hellenistic era. And he underneath this boulder, it's this kind of mysterious, it's a Hollywood scene of, a guy finds his name is Muhammad Ali, finds a container of, was around 50 books. I think it was 13 bound books or so, but 50 different documents. They even burned some for the fire, apparently, before we were able to recover. So we lost a couple on the way. But Jung was even involved in helping find some of them, I believe. Anyway,
Wow.
they finally came to light a couple decades later. You can Google it right now. You can read the Gospel of Thomas online for free. You don't even need to buy it. And what's so striking about it, there's a lot of documents in what's called the Nag Hammadi Library. Fun fact, Plato's Republic is in there. So that's kind of,
Interesting.
they were cosmopolitan monks. And they hid these documents. Why did they do that? Well, it's because the orthodoxy said, to burn these books. And so civilization is indebted to the brave souls who knows what happened to them, the guys who buried these books. But we have the complete Gospel of Thomas. And what's fascinating to me about it, and to many scholars and mystics as well, which is it is a sayings gospel. So it is 117 sayings of Jesus. It has no plot, unlike the four gospels of the Bible. It's just 1 through 117. Jesus said, da, da, da. And, again, kind of back to the scholarly aspect here, that's got to be pretty early if there's no plot, right? Because, even the Gospel of Mark, which is the first gospel, has a pretty complex plot. It's not, it's symbolic. It has, it's a narrative of his life. There's a lot of, intellectual strength that comes in through even the first gospel of the New Testament. So the fact that Thomas is just bullet points of the sayings of the Savior is significant. And beyond that, gosh, I should know this exactly. Wonder if I could Google it really quickly. I believe I'll say this: there's 117 sayings. At least 43 are nearly identical to other sayings in the Synoptic Gospels in Mark, Matthew, and Luke that Jesus says. Thomas has the mustard seed. It has the wedding garment. It has, what do you think I am? Who do you think I am? People familiar with the Bible will see some familiar teachings in Thomas. And, what's so exciting about it to me is in Thomas, it's simpler. Almost always, it's a simpler version. And in the Synoptic Gospels, the earliest stories that we have that are canonized in the Bible, they're more complicated. They're more complex than the simpler, more primitive version in Thomas, which again implies early. It implies how early it was. So I can't emphasize enough. It's not conspiratorial whatsoever to suggest that Thomas potentially is contemporary, and maybe John Dominic Crossan says this, who's one of the most renowned New Testament scholars in the world, says that it might even be before the Gospels of the New Testament. So it's really worth checking out. And it is extremely mystical. It's extremely Eastern. It sounds like the Upanishads. Jesus says something like, pour a bucket of water and I am there, chop a piece of wood and I am there. It's very kind of panentheistic in terms of its mystical, poetic teaching. He says, bring out what is, if you do not bring out what is within you, you will be destroyed. If you do bring out what is within you, you will be saved. It's this internal journey. It's this internal kind of mystical guidebook. So yeah, very interesting. And like I said, with some of the likeliness of the teachings in Mark and Matthew are bolstered by Thomas, but in the Jesus Seminar, for example, they're looking at the overlapping sayings in Thomas to point out, what is authentic to Jesus in terms of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and what's not.
I remember when that Jesus Seminar came up. I was young,
Mhm.
and my family was still very much Christian, and there was
They were controversial.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot that was said about that, but I'm definitely thankful that it happened because I see it so differently now. But here's a question for you. Do you have a personal opinion on Jesus's lost years because his teachings seem to have been so mystical to you? I mean, some people say that he went and studied in the East. Do you have an opinion on that?
I'm open to it. I do write about it in my book. I Original Sin is a Lie, out now. Haha, commercial break. Yogananda says he went there. Bible scholars are pretty unwilling to concede that he left Judea, but that's okay. Like I said, it's not perfect what they're doing. They're just looking at likelihoods and so on. And who knows? We could always discover more information, more, future texts, etc., future evidence that dates back. There's plenty of hypotheses of what happened, because to your point, the lost years of Jesus, 12 to 30. There's one moment when he's 12 and he's in the temple teaching, right? And then in 30, all of a sudden he's getting baptized by John at the Jordan. So yeah, there's a big missing gap there. And the claim is that what Yogananda says is that the Magi were Indian princes that were essentially coming. It says in Matthew, they came from the east, is the verse. And Yogananda says, that's it, India's east. And it's also not too crazy, because there were trade routes at that time. Even Alexander the Great, for example, had an Indian yogi teacher, which was 300 years before Jesus. So we know that those were not disconnected cultures. The Greco-Roman world was very connected from trade routes and conquests. Yeah, Yogananda says that the three magi were rishis who were coming to basically pay their respects to the next avatar who was being born. This, very, very powerful teacher who would help to uplift humanity is coming. And so they came to honor him. And so he essentially, in kind of Yogananda's explanation of the lost years, he went back to kind of pay respects to them for coming and honoring him, and also to learn methods of meditation and mystic teachings and so on. So there's also, it starts to get a bit more conspiratorial in terms of where he stayed and stuff like this. There's this idea that he stayed at the Hemis monastery in Tibet. That claim has been made and not fully verified, but I do write about in the book some of the sources for it. There's also a really great source I'll point people to, if anyone is interested more on the subject beyond my book, ocoy.org. It's Original Christianity, originalyoga.org. It's Abbot George Burke. His Swami name is Nirmalananda, I believe, Nirmalananda. He's written a fantastic book about Jesus' potential adventure in India.
Thank you for sharing those.
Sure.
Yeah, I would love to ask you, and I think I probably have an idea based on what you've already said, but in your personal journey, where have you landed on this question of who Jesus really was? Would you say that he was more of a Jewish reformer, or just a spiritual teacher? Or would you say that he's, like Yogananda said, an avatar?
I'm comfortable with avatar, and I think I realize that word is not very familiar to most Americans, but essentially, yeah, it means someone who broke the veil, right? It means someone who became enlightened, who saw through the separation, is kind of a term from mystic philosophy, or in Hinduism is called Maya, the veil of Maya, of illusion, that being separate is actually illusory. So what did Jesus do? He saw the unity everywhere he looked. Love your enemies, forgiving his killers are really kind of my favorite quick examples of his advancement. It's which is his death in the Gospel of Luke. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That's about as good as it gets, in my view, in terms of having a heart just reverberating from a place of compassion and forgiveness and love. And so, yeah, I think it's a real honor to study his life and teachings and contemplate his wisdom. And at the same time, he doesn't have to be the sole gateway. I think that's my biggest distinction. It's like I get on my stuff, Original Sin is a Lie Instagram, I get angry atheists and angry Christians. It's
Right.
like that people see my thing and they're like, oh, cool. Original Sin's a Lie, but then they're like, oh, wait, you love Jesus? It's like, yeah, I'm too religious for the atheists and I'm too critical for the religious. So, where's my home? But yeah, I deeply honor Jesus, and I just it's quite clear. I mean, Yogananda, who's behind my wall here, big influence on me, massive, in terms of saying no. Every religion has men and women, and there's men and women who don't practice religion that get there. But in every corner of the world, in every time period, essentially, there's men and women who have attained this level of, unity consciousness, is sometimes called Christ consciousness, that are worth studying and revering and, trying to imitate, essentially trying to become. That's the big difference, right, between the Christian religion and, or the exoteric and the esoteric, is that the esoterics are they're a model for us to all work towards, whereas the religion says, oh, no, I'm not Jesus. And it's like, well, you're not right now. But that was in the mystic's view, in our view, that was the goal, was to try to get to his level.
Right. Well, Bob, I would love to go back to this idea that you mentioned in the beginning of sort of the common thread that runs throughout the different mystical traditions of the world being that the divine is within us. And I would like to ask you, in your studies, how far have you found that we can trace back this idea into the history of humanity?
That's a good question. It does show up in a few. I mean, really, Hinduism and, what's kind of called Vedic philosophy. Hinduism comes from the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are ancient Indian texts. They're the ones who gave us the idea of the Atman, which is a Sanskrit word for soul, but that's a reductive word. It really means kind of a part of the one. That's maybe lowercase o to the capital O. Buddhism, for example, also, it's called Buddha nature. And, again, most mystical sects, most mystical paths see the divine in all beings. Rumi, the great Persian Sufi mystic from, about 900 years ago, says, I looked for the divine in churches, temples, and mosques, but I found the divine in my heart. That's really, isn't that good? I mean, that's really the crux of it, is that, it's nowhere else but in you, and your own consciousness, your own capacity to experience the present moment, the connective inner being between all beings. I mean, that is divine, that's divinity. And the ego mind, which we haven't talked about that term, but that comes into play in kind of spiritual psychology, mystic philosophy, the ego mind, and really, in my view, the worst of institutional religion. I do agree with you, what you said earlier, that I actually do believe Christianity is a valid path to God as well. And there's Christians, contemplative Christians, Christian mystics, that have really shown us that. St. Francis, St. Teresa. I'm reading Mother Francis Cabrini. I love the Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart, but that really is the worst of what the ego does and the institutional religion does, is they say, oh, what you're looking for is out there. And in contemporary society, in late stage capitalism, it's, you're looking for money, a partner, material gains, fame, perspective of others, and so on. And what the mystics, and really I think the Hindus do put it quite well, and the Buddhists, is to say, don't worry that much about what's going on out there. I mean, you still do your work. And I talk about this kind of tightrope, if you will, in terms of, it doesn't mean you're apathetic. It doesn't mean you're indifferent to the world, but it does mean that your happiness isn't dependent on the external, which is a subtle thing. And that's, happy to go into more detail about that if you like. But, the kingdom is within you. And what that does is, by understanding your own self-compassion, self-love, connection to the divine, and so on, that generates compassion. Compassion inspires action to help relieve suffering. It's connected in that way. But it's not, but if there's lack in there and you're searching for it elsewhere, that's different. That's the cause of all this chaos and all this violence.
I love what you just said there because you brought together the two, I guess you could say, the two greatest commandments of all of the mystical traditions that I've heard, which would be we are all one and the divine is within you, and love your neighbor as yourself. And basically you explained it. What I heard you saying is if the divine is within you, if you are divine, then you recognize that everyone else is that same thing that you are, and it causes you to have compassion for them.
They're here. Yeah, Ram Dass is great too. I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with his stuff. I mean, he's the one who says, like, I'm at the bank and I'm looking at the bank teller and she doesn't know she's the divine mother, but I do.
Mhm.
you know, it's like I'm going to see the holiness as best I can, in everyone. And, if everyone else isn't aware of it yet, that's all right. That's the veil of Maya. That's the veil of ignorance. I think kind of to come back to the original sin is a lie thing. I get some funny comments, as you can imagine. And, this guy was like, original sin is not a lie. Have you met a person? You know? And it's funny. And it's like, yeah, we're not perfect. That's true. But what the Hindu, what the East says in general is that it's just our ignorance about ourselves. It's not that we're stained by this, divine condemnation, filthy guilt, shame, and so on. It's just that we don't know ourselves and we don't know the true essence of our own nature and the nature of all beings. Once you start to chip away at it, for me, it's very incremental. It's not this radical, instantaneous thing, which does happen, when you study the saints and the spiritual mystics. Sometimes men and women throughout history will just all of a sudden the light bulb's on. The Buddha under the Bodhi tree. There's modern examples too, but for me, it's just been very gradual over time. That's okay.
I think that's how it is for most of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. But I know it's working. It's like I'm becoming a little kinder, to people and myself, and little less fear, little less anxiety, a little more peace. Just that's all right. I'm just gonna keep on riding that 51%. That's that's all I want.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. This is one of the most fascinating conversations that I've had. And I
Oh,
would
thank
like to,
you.
yeah, of course. Thank you. I'd like to give you a chance to share with the viewers where they can find you and specifically where they can find your book, where they can find some of the films that you've made and anything else you have going on.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm pretty active on Instagram at Original Sin is a Lie. I believe if you even search, because my dad has the same name and he's a writer, and if you search Bob Peck book, it's me. And I was like, sorry, Dad, I passed you on Google. Love you, man. But yeah, the book is on Amazon. I also read it on Audible. I think it's on Spotify as well. It's in all the book places. Original Sin is a Lie, Bob Peck. I'm working on essentially kind of reawakening and rebranding my podcast. Is coming out this year. It's called Let's Break the Veil. And thank you. And yeah, we'll be interviewing basically spiritual teachers and creatives and activists and trying to do 1/100th of the impact Melissa's doing with her pod and we'll see, but just getting started. The book came out last year, so just like I said, not slowing down, just getting started.
That's amazing. And thank you for the kind words, but I am sure that you will quickly surpass me with all of the just, I mean, you're so good at articulating this stuff.
Thank you so much. We're a team.
That's right.
May our work help folks remember their own beauty, their own inherent value.
Absolutely. That's what it's all about. Well, thank you again, Bob.
They're here.
Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video with your friends, and comment with your thoughts and opinions. And check the description box for the links to my TikTok and Instagram, where I share the more personal side of my life, my website, where I share my paintings and merch, and also the Be a Guest link for anybody who's interested in sharing their story. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.